What if I told you that before you can do this, you first need to learn how to do this? What I'm referring to is values, one of the fundamentals that most artists ignore. So today I'll be showing you how practicing values changed my art from this to this, and as well some insights on how to practice values. What are values? Values refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. Pretty simple, right? Well, not quite.
NANI?!
For instance, which gray do you think is lighter? A or B? If you answer B, then you are 100% wrong because A and B actually has the same values. But since the surrounding values is different, it changes the perception of the viewer that one is lighter and the other is darker. That is why it is very important to look at the relationship of each values instead of looking at it independently. Before we begin, there are 3 essential rules you must follow. The first one is always use a 100 opacity hard round brush. The second one is blending brushes are off limits. Then the third one, this is just my personal recommendation, but avoid converting your references into grayscale because when you do that, you're just copying what you see. The goal here is for you to learn how to observe and train your eyes to recognize and interpret values as they appear in real life. There are 3 types of studies I used to learn and practice values. The first one is the 2-value study where you work with only black and white value. Then the second one is the 3-value study where you use 3 distinct values. Then the third one is the progressive value study where you gradually add more values as you develop your painting. The first thing we should always do is begin with a 2-value study. Now, the goal of a 2-value study is to train our brains to think in simplified shapes while still communicating the intended message through those shapes. So this is our first reference. Obviously, there are many values present, so one technique I use to simplify values is squinting. Squinting basically blurs the image and reduces small details, allowing you to focus on the larger group of values instead of individual smaller ones. The first step in 2-value study is to observe and paint the overall shape or silhouette of the subject. In our reference, it looks something like this. The second step is to identify which areas are black and white. So in our reference, I see that these areas are white and these areas are black. Now in most cases, I use black for the shadowed areas and white for the parts where light source hits. But then again, this isn't a hard rule. Always choose your values based on the relationship to other values. Now for face, I can see that these areas can be treated as black, but I'm going to focus on these simplified shapes instead because I think these shapes are already enough to convey human face. Let's add the highlights to her hair. I'll just create a simplified shapes that are enough to convey the highlights in her hair. Now that we have completed the 2-value study, it's time to move on to the next step, the 3-value study. In this study, we're building on the 2-value study we did before, and since we are working with an additional value, our added goal is to train our brain to be also aware of the relationship between each value. First step is to replace white value with a slightly darker value, though this step is completely up to you, but in my process, white values are used in either 2-value study or areas where the light source hits. Now, the second step is to identify where the light source is going to be. This will give us an idea where to put the lighter and darker values. For her face, I'm going to select a slightly darker value. Since the light source is coming from below, these areas in her face will be lighter compared to the rest of her skin. Now I'm gonna take the same value I used for the skin and apply it to her hair to add more volume. There's our 3-value study. You can see by adding just one more value, the subject's form improved drastically. So what if we added even more values? This brings us to the progressive value study. The goal of progressive value study is pretty much the same, but with an increased level of difficulty. In this study, there is no strict step-by-step process, but there are three main elements I focused on adding. This is not in order, but the first one is the midtones. I'm adding midtones to her hair to give it more depth and volume. Next, I add the highlights or lighter values to further indicate where the light source hits. The last one is adding darker values. To me, darker values represent areas where the light source doesn't reach, and like midtones, they also enhance the three-dimensional form of the subject. By the way guys, it's completely okay to adjust some of the existing values as you go. For example, the shadow above her nose are too dark right now, so I'm going to lighten them up to balance the overall composition. You may be wondering, how can you tell if you did well? One technique I use is zoom out to painting like this, and if I can still recognize the overall composition, then that means I did well. And there's our progressive value study. And here's the comparison between all three. Now let's move on to the next demonstration, but this time we will do environment. As usual, let's start with a two-value study. Again, the first thing we need to do is identify the silhouette of the subject. Alright, once we have the silhouettes, next thing to do is identify the dark and light values. As for the rocks, I'll simplify the shape to indicate they are being hit by the light source. I'm going to add some white silhouettes of the rock here, because in our reference, even though the main light source isn't hitting this area, we can see it's being softly illuminated by a second light source called bounce light. And we are done. With just 3 steps, we were able to create a convincing copy of our reference even though we are only using 2 values. Now let's move on to the 3-value study. As usual, the first thing I'm gonna do is remove the white value. After that, let's identify where the light source is. However, we can skip this step since we've already addressed it during the 2-value study. Now, if you want to suggest distance with value, all you need to do is use lighter value like this. Also, I'm gonna add some lighter values here to define the bounce light even more. There's our 3-value study. Now let's move on to the progressive value study. Now I'm gonna add some midtones. And I'm gonna add some simple shapes to define the form of these areas. Since we are working with more values, we can lighten the value of these areas to better indicate greater distance. Since these areas are being hit by a bounce light, I will adjust its value to a darker value because bounce light is less intense compared to the main light source. Now I'm just gonna add some more simple shapes with different values to further define the overall form of the composition. Now, since these areas are being hit directly by the light source, I'm gonna change it to white value. Here's the moment of truth, guys. Let's zoom out and see if you can still recognize the painting. Yep, I did good. There's our progressive value study. And here's the comparison between all three. There it is, the result of this study. Hopefully you've learned something new. Feel free to tweak everything you have learned in this video to suit your own style. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like, and if you want to see more art content like this, feel free to subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye!
Ipit. Taba. Ah, taba.